Dr. Balboni, thanks for coming back to Contagion.
Thanks for having me again, Grant.
So for those of us who didn't see your first interview, could you just briefly go over what Appili is working on with respect to Favipiravir and other drugs, and we'll take it from there.
So, excuse me. So, as you know, Appili Therapeutics is a biotechnology company involved in infectious diseases across a number of areas, including COVID-19, as many are. And we're working on a specific product, drug you alluded to, Favipiravir, a broad-spectrum antiviral for early to moderate treatment of COVID-19 patients across North America at this point.
And how was it selected for investigation as a therapeutic? There's a lot of these different experimental drugs for COVID now.
So, as a company, it certainly starts with the science. We are a scientifically based and medically based company seeking to address unmet needs across the infectious disease space. We've been working with Favipiravir, again, as a broad spectrum antiviral for a long time. It's something we've been aware of. And so we first and foremost look for a mechanistic understanding of how these drugs work. And we've seen, based on the data, that it would have an effect on coronavirus and SARS-CoV-2 in particular, the agent that causes COVID-19. And then we look to see whether or not we can complete a clinical trial in a timely fashion to really add to the body of knowledge around whether this drug works. And so it's a two-step process: science and medicine first, and then the practical aspects of can we design and run a clinical trial to answer a specific question that will help address the need.
Excellent. So last we discussed this, we've moved forward a bit in terms of the clinical trials. There's an expansion with the phase 2 trial. Is that correct?
It is. We've expanded. We first gained approval to move forward, or clearance, if you will, to move forward with Health Canada in the long-term care population in Ontario. And then we always had planned to expand to go where the need was greatest, especially in this population. And so we had submitted to the Food and Drug Administration for their consideration, and we received a letter allowing us to proceed with that clinical trial.
And that focuses on, you mentioned targeting areas of high risk. This is focused on long-term care facilities, nursing homes. And can you get into a little bit of why Favipiravir might be a particularly good option in those settings?
So I think, again, first and foremost, it's about the unmet need. It is, been unfortunately documented at this point that 80% of the mortality in Ontario with this pandemic has been in the long-term care community. And importantly, also 40% of the observed mortality in the United States, the country with probably the greatest number of cases at this point. 40% of the mortality was seen in long-term care in that population, and so it's very clear to us that that's an area of real unmet need. A number of other drugs have started to think about that population as well, but I'm pleased to say that in the beginning we and our clinical team recognized that, and we're really first movers in that space to try and bring a solution to that population.
How do you determine whether COVID-19 is spreading or not in a particular nursing home setting? Because we all know at this point that asymptomatic, mild, asymptomatic, these are important vectors for transmission, and they're very hard to detect.
They are. Yeah, so I think it's a two-part answer to the question. Great question, because it is quite difficult to figure out how and when to treat. And that, at the end of the day, because we're going after mild to moderate cases, is critically important The mechanism of action of this drug means that you got to get it on board quickly. In my opinion, I mean, I think that's where we're going to see the greatest value from a drug like this, based on how we know it works. And so the trials have been designed very purposefully to go after those mild to moderate patients, meaning you identify a site, a long-term care facility, and you test. And an outbreak is considered to be one or more positive test cases in that home. And so once you have the outbreak, you provide the drug to others that may be negative. And really what we're looking for is the ability to prevent transmission from that first positive case or that incident case to those other residents in the home. And we compare that against a placebo or standard of care home to look for differences between the two. And this is a very well articulated trial design called the cluster randomized trial design that was used for drugs like Tamiflu. And so we're not blazing a new trail here. We're using a lot of the work that's been done previously, identify the outbreak, that first case, and then give drug to those folks and look for a difference between the rates of transmission or the ability to transmit in the home.
Thank you for that very useful explanation. Now, how many of these long-term healthcare facilities, nursing homes, are you expecting to participate in the clinical trials?
So again, I'm no biostatistician, but of course they've worked out the powering for this kind of study, and we need to look at 16 homes, 8 treated and 8 placebo, in order to detect the differences that we think we're going to find with this drug. And so that doesn't sound like a whole lot of homes, but of course each of these long-term care centers, the units, have 20 to 30 residents per unit, and so it adds up fairly quickly. I think what's really important is that in order to get those 16 units, we're having to evaluate, screen, and monitor hundreds of units, and so I think that the logistical challenges that our team faces are significant. And again, we're relying on a team, clinical team that's done this before for Tamiflu. So I think this is again something they've done in the past, but they're going to be looking at and monitoring hundreds of homes in order to get the 16 that we need, and that's both in Canada and the U.S.
Is there a way while you're conducting the trials, and I'm sure this is to get into the weeds of how you'd adjust for this confounding variable, you'd have to talk to an investigator, but is there a way to assess the non-pharmaceutical interventions that are going on across these different homes you're looking at? Because I know that can interfere with the results, but I know there are also ways to, even after the fact exclude that data.
Yeah, so again, it does get into some of the complexities around the operation. How do you operationalize a trial like this? And I think really what you need to do, and some of the things you're talking about are things like cohorting, or removing residents who are ill from the home and how that may affect transmission. And as you said earlier, how do you define that incident case? Because asymptomatic treatment, you can imagine you may have someone who's positive but asymptomatic. So if you're looking just for symptoms, you may have a whole pool of people who are positive and able to transmit. And so I think, there are certainly lots of different ways to address these potential confounding variables. One of them is that when we screen these sites, we're very careful to look to try and make it as much of an apples to apples comparison in terms of how the sites are run, what the standards of care are for the residents and how they treat them. And then also looking for similarities in staff in terms of numbers and in the way that they look at the residents. And so it is an incredibly complex process, but one that's taken into account as part of the trial design.
And do you have a timeline for these phase 2 trials?
So if you had asked me that, a month ago, which you did or so, I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was certainly in the beginning of the pandemic, and the ability to enroll in Canada at that point was certainly happening faster. The fall off happened more quickly. I think now, with the expansion to the US, where it's very unfortunate, but the outbreaks are still occurring, unlike what's happening in Canada. I think we're looking at the end of the year for results. And I would say a recent New York Times article touched just on this point, that many of the drug trials that are ongoing right now are having a very difficult time meeting the projections and timelines. I think we're learning as we go. And I think right now the best information across all of the drug trials that are going on is probably 3 to 6 months from initiation. So that for us puts us at the end.
I mean, do you guys feel for the Operation Warp Speed vaccine people? Because I know that there's a lot of promises being made on a vaccine timeline as well, that now biotech is having to kind of, policy people, regulators, political people put these timelines out there a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's a great thought, and probably fuel for many discussions after this pandemic is resolved. How do we manage expectations in the middle of a pandemic? There are aspirational goals, which I think is everybody's. Nobody. Let me start by saying I don't think it's anybody has bad intentions or malintent in terms of what they're doing. It really is the best guess at the time with the information that you have, and I think clinicians and scientists all struggle with this. Of course, everybody wants a treatment yesterday. We all do. So I think we're working with the best information we have at the time. And I think we have to continue to make those statements that science takes time. I think we are still moving, all of these studies are moving at an incredible pace. We're looking at, 8 months ago that this really started. Nobody knew what the scope of this outbreak or pandemic would be at that point. And so we're still we're in very early days scientifically. So I think the best thing we can do is take the information, give the best information we have, and try our best to avoid the sound bites that everybody wants, or giving people information that they just want to hear, and really lay it out there that people are working tirelessly to try and solve this problem, but it's a very, very complex problem.
Well, I think that grounded approach is going to serve you well long term. I'll ask, do you have additional clinical trials planned for after the phase 2?
We do, and so much like our planned expansion of the long-term care trial, we have other trials planned, including phase 3 trials as well. And so I think again, our approach to all of this is to gather the scientific information and look for the unmet need. And for us, we believe that those at highest risk of getting the illness in the early to moderate stage, if we can reduce viral shedding, for example, I think that's a great and meaningful endpoint. And so we're taking the information that we're receiving from the regulators. It really is a partnership. So the comments that we get from Health Canada and FDA are certainly informing the next group of trials that I think you'll see coming very soon.
When do you think, based on all this timeline thing, I mean, we both just said that it's not necessarily the kind of thing where you can look at a magic orb and have a date, and people should not hold anybody to these sound bites that unfortunately so much of science journalism has become about lately. But all that being said, mm-hmm. Tempered, when would you anticipate this drug potentially being available in the US for prevention and or treatment?
I believe that it's the end of this year.
Yeah,
I do. I think that's a really. It could be a little bit earlier because there are some mechanisms for having drugs made available, and I think they did. I know they did this with remdesivir, that they first went down the path of emergency use. But the regulators right now need to see some efficacy in a study that's powered sufficiently to answer the question of whether or not it's going to work as intended. And so I think as soon as that first trial comes, there's a real reason to believe that emergency use authorization is something that we should be shooting for in the U.S. to make the drug more widely available to more people.
And so would that potentially be before the release of the results at the end of the year then? I mean, we're talking hypotheticals.
Yeah, I think again, I think that we're really waiting for a study to kind of to give people the comfort that you can push down on the side of the scale for efficacy without really altering this idea of safety, right? And that's what regulators are trying to do, that balance all the time. Does the evidence support giving it to more people because now we know it could work, even though there may be some risk? If we don't have efficacy, then we rest our hat on the kind of safety side. And so I think we're really just waiting for those studies. And I think there have been studies. Glenmark, the Indian company, recently announced a phase 3 results in a small number of patients. It was open label, 150 patients, and it was early to moderate COVID-19, and it demonstrated a reduction in both viral shedding and duration of symptoms. And so I think those are the kinds of studies that, if they were just a little bit larger, would actually sway the regulators to consider this for emergency use. Now, to be fully fair and transparent, I think you have to balance that on the other side with the fact that we know a lot about this drug, Favipiravir. We know that there is some potential teratogenicity noted for this drug, and so you probably don't want to give this drug to women of childbearing age who aren't on birth control, for example, or young men who could father children without some sort of protection. And there are ways to do that, but again, they're balancing those ideas of risk to benefit. And I have to say, that is also one of the reasons that we think long-term care is a great use for this product. There are fewer concerns around pregnancy, obviously, in folks of that age range. So I think it's tailor-made for a group like that.
That's an excellent point about the age group. Are there other reasons? I know that, for example, say we get an effective vaccine, there are some vaccines that are safe for the general public or have minimal adverse events for the general public, but are a different story when you're looking in that age group.
It's true. And so I think, when you start giving a vaccine, it is the ultimate pre-exposure prophylaxis, right? I mean, this is really what we're talking about, is preventing disease. And that has always been the holy grail. But when you're giving a product to lots and lots of otherwise healthy people, again, you have to really balance the prevention against any potential risk. And some of those risks are very well known. And as you get older, for example, vaccines tend to be less effective in the elderly. Your immune system tends to be less primed, if you will, to kind of take up that vaccine and enable a robust immune response. And so, is that the right population to vaccinate? Probably. Is it going to work? It may not. And so the drug, again, is particularly well tailored to deal with those situations. And I think you need only look to oseltamivir or Tamiflu for drugs that are used. Even though we have a perfectly good seasonal vaccine most years, the elderly just don't generate as robust a response. And so we have to use these drugs even though we have a vaccine available. And I think we'll be faced with a very similar situation.
I'm also curious about the regulatory status of the drug in other countries. I know that there's a story here with Japan, for example. I know other countries have expressed interest. Is there anywhere that's ahead of the curve on us in terms of emergency authorization, for example?
So the drug is approved. First of all, there's a lot of experience with this drug around the world. It is generic.
What were the previous applications? If you could just, I probably said it, but
no, it's a good question. So it has been approved. It was studied and approved in Japan for pandemic flu. They also ran phase 3 clinical trials for pandemic flu in the United States and chose not to move forward with authorization. It's been approved in China for pandemic flu. And now recently it was announced that it was approved under emergency use in both India and Russia. And so I think
for COVID-19.
For COVID-19, I'm sorry. Yeah. So China and Japan for pandemic flu, and then India, Russia for COVID-19. So certainly people are moving forward. I think it's also worth mentioning that as a generic drug, many manufacturers have come forward now with their own versions of Favipiravir, which presents unique challenges to the regulators. You need to demonstrate that all of those different drugs are in fact the same or bioequivalent, and then run clinical trials. And so, there's a lot of activity. Unfortunately, I think it hasn't been as well coordinated as it could be in terms of pooling data, finding creative ways to help the regulators get to a yes, demonstrate that efficacy and safety with all of these different formulations. I think it's going to happen, but it's a slow roll, if you will, towards approval.
So we tend to think about some of these things competitively, but are you saying then that different stakeholders who also might provide this drug have room to collaborate on getting good information over to regulators? Is that?
That's exactly what I'm saying. I think we are continuing to have discussions with other stakeholders in this space. We're certainly not the only company that's out there interested in this, but we believe that there's room to partner with the likes of Fuji and other companies around the world who we already have relationships with to help accelerate approval by presenting a robust data package. And so that's part of the business discussions that we have ongoing with all of these folks.
We'll pivot back to the clinical in just a moment, but to build on what you just said, is there kind of market share, so to speak, for several firms to get production of Favipiravir going, or is this a kind of race to the finish line situation?
To be determined. I would like to think, as a small biotechnology company, we can and are socially conscious. We undertook this fight because it was the right one, and we were at the right place at the right time, and we felt it was the right thing to do. It doesn't mean that all of the actors out there have that same mentality, but I have to say most of the potential partners that we've spoken with all have taken the view that you have, which is let's work together, let's pool the data, let's figure out which geographies are most important to us. Each of these companies comes from different places in the world, and so they may have different or competing pressures on them to generate
access.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think these are all parts of the discussions we're having, and we would love we would like nothing more than to be involved, continue to be involved with companies that take that same view. And so that's our goal, is to try and work with a number of these different actors where it makes sense, because it's the right thing to do.
So to pivot back to the clinical and the pharmacology, are there other drugs like this on the market or in development? For example, how does this compare with remdesivir?
So remdesivir is the logical comparison. They both target an RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, a molecule that's necessary for the virus to replicate inside the cell. And lots is known about how that works. Of course, that's a mechanistic understanding of how it works, and lots of work has been done in models to understand how it works. The difference, of course, is that remdesivir is given intravenously, and favipiravir is given as an oral tablet. And so that's just a property of the drug. And so I think both have a place. One, I think, is more logically situated to be used in hospital, which is remdesivir, which is how it's now being used and how it's approved. But that's a very hard thing to do in a long-term care setting, for example, to give an IV drug. It takes lots of nursing time. It's certainly more complicated, and tablets are the logical drug there. There are a couple of other drugs out there, also broad-spectrum antivirals, that are trying to also work in this space. A recently announced program by Eli Lilly and a company called AbCellera out of Canada, a small private company. They're looking at a monoclonal antibody therapeutic, which is given by infusion. They're actually creating infusion vans, to go to long-term care centers.
The mobile unit,
exactly. Yeah, but again, this is a very it's an elegant solution, but it's a very difficult one, and I frankly we'll be curious to see how they make that work in the marketplace. I think that's a very different proposition and probably a lot more expensive. But again, it calls for lots of different tools, and I think we need to be investigating all of these potential solutions, because we will find a place where each of these drugs has a natural fit. And I think that's really important, to not view this as an overly competitive environment right now, but allow the properties of the drugs and the clinical trials, frankly, to speak for themselves. Let's give solutions to folks, and then we can also at the same time tackle how we're going to deploy these things.
It makes a lot of sense, and I mean that question you raised about profitability and social consciousness, with the rollout of this. How do I phrase this? You know, why don't we double back to that question? I'll ask my next one. If Favipiravir earns that regulatory approval that's being sought out, how do you intend to meet demand?
So, if you would ask me again that question in March or April, we were in a very different environment, and we were working with Fuji at that point, just trying to figure out how are we going to get 10,000, 20,000, 80,000 tablets that we need from Japan to Canada. And we worked around that logistical problem just because there weren't enough available. There were countries lining up at that point asking for millions of doses that they couldn't meet. They couldn't meet the manufacturing demand, much less the logistical nightmare of how do you get them out of a country during a pandemic. So we saw that problem, we tackled that problem together, and we were able to get tablets to Canada for our to be in place for our trial. And so that was the problem of the moment. I think since then, what the world has done, many companies have done, particularly in India. If you look to India, they have taken a statement made by Fuji early on in the pandemic that they would not be enforcing their manufacturing IP rights in the middle of a pandemic. I thought this was the opening shot of this kind of idea of pharmaceutical socially conscious behavior, right? I mean, they said folks can make it. We're not going to enforce our rights. And by and large, generics companies around the world took that up, and they've been making product for their home countries. So what started as a real bottleneck, do we even have enough tablets, is no longer a problem. There are probably millions of tablets being made a month now. And now the bottleneck is, do we have enough large, well-designed, well-controlled clinical trials to demonstrate whether or not this works? And so I'm happy to say we've moved past the manufacturing and some of the logistical issues into the realm of an area where I think we add a lot of value as a company. Can we design and run clinical trials to answer the question to the satisfaction of everybody, including the regulators, does this work?
So to pivot back to what I was going to say before, just wanted to get the phrasing right because it's such a thick, complicated issue. When we talk about healthcare dollars and we talk about profitability, I think sometimes we view these as economics versus health. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, especially as more of a mid-sized biotechnology company that is trying to weigh these things on balance, what that connection between money and health is. And I'm not really asking from a political perspective, but more from, as a firm, the incentives and the ways that you navigate those. And in general, we hear stuff like, well, this drug costs so much, but every life is worth more than money can imagine. Well, how do dollars translate to health, right? Is I guess my question.
So as a company, and I'll try not to get too philosophical about it, because I think it's a really potentially very deep question, and one that we need to grapple with as a society, regardless of where you are. But as a company, one of the reasons we founded this company is that there's a philosophy that we have, which is do good, do well. And we believe that by doing good work, by going after the unmet need, the market conditions will, by and large, resolve with time. If you can demonstrate that you're adding real value to the medical community, if you're preventing loss of life, as you said before, that loss of life is is oftentimes thought of as incalculable. But many economists will tell you that it is actually calculable, that you can figure out what that's worth. And we believe by going after the greatest unmet need with very, very severe diseases or severe outcomes, that will always be on the right side of society doing good, and the economists doing well, and they'll reward that behavior. Now, what is that quantum of reward? We're not sure from an economic standpoint, but to date, all of our programs have shown promise, both for solving critically unmet need from fungal diseases to COVID-19, to gram-negative bacterial infections, to vaccines. And so we've tried to focus on that do good part, and so far so good. The economics have also worked out.
All right, I've got just two more questions. The first is, what would Appili's roles and rights be in Canada or in the United States if we do see regulatory approval pertaining to COVID-19? And you touched on this a bit, but what does the rights situation look like for the drug?
Sure. So I think for the first question, we are in continuing negotiations for that economic piece. In terms of our responsibilities for participating, it's to run these well-controlled clinical trials, and we're doing that. So we've designed and initiated those trials, and those discussions, those business discussions about what it might look like. I think you can expect that we will have obviously an oversized focus on Canada. We talked about geographical responsibility before, and I think we have a great responsibility to Canada to ensure that happens. Now, we are geographically agnostic as our viruses, and so I think we're making a great contribution to the ability to the program in the United States, and so I think you can expect participation for Appili in that market as well. And I think that's as much as I want to disclose about those ongoing discussions, but they are happening, and I expect that it will move in that direction. And then, I'm sorry, remind me of the second question.
Well, you sort of got into it, actually. I think you answered it pretty sufficiently. So what I'll go for, just to close things off, first, I'll just open the floor to if there's anything about the drug you want to share, or for clinicians, for the general audience, but people with an interest in infectious diseases and what the long-term picture is here and that kind of thing, and then like ramifications, that kind of thing. And then I'll just ask you, it's been a long pandemic for a lot of us. What's something you're optimistic about going forward?
Sure. So the first, in terms of information about Favipiravir, I always start with the mechanistic understanding of the drug. Do we think that it has the possibility or the ability to actually tackle the problem that's in front of us? And I think from a preclinical standpoint, we know a lot about this drug, and mechanistically, we believe it works. The second piece is a little more complicated, and for clinicians, how do we determine what the right dose is in order to make sure that it's different? Real world is different than animal models. I think the data are accumulating around that. There's been experience with this drug. Originally, I was looking at it for Ebola, and was involved in some of that work. The doses were very, very high, and so I think we have a good understanding of what the dose needs to be and how we would use this drug to maintain that efficacy. And then finally, safety. It's been in thousands of patients, certainly more than 3,000 in controlled trials, but many thousands more now with COVID-19. And so I think we understand the safety profile of this product. And so if we understand the warts of this drug or any problem around any drug, it would be around the potential teratogenicity. And so understanding who you would use that in, at what dose, and how it would work, I think we're starting to get to the point where this is going to be a very well understood drug, and clinicians should and will feel comfortable giving it. I think that's really important, and it's this is not a science experiment, but it does take time to gather that information, and I think we're doing all of that work now.
Thank you very much. That's all super helpful information, and it was nice to talk to you again.
Great. And I forgot, optimism, right? What am I optimistic about? because I, like everybody else, am having a bit of COVID-19 fatigue, and this is incredibly trying for everybody. I'm happy to see so many people working together to make treatments a reality. I think that the vaccine, efforts have been just incredible, and I'm hopeful that we will have a whole bunch of tools in our toolbox, vaccines and therapeutics, by the end of the year or early next year. And I think that really is something that gives me hope going forward.
Dr. Balboni, thank you again.
All right, thanks, Grant.